In the early decades of the 20th century, American military planners drew up a strategy for a potential conflict with the Japanese Empire. They called it War Plan Orange. On paper, it was straightforward. If hostilities broke out, American battleships would steam across the Pacific, engage the Japanese fleet, and pound them into submission. But the reality of modern war rarely conforms to pristine theories. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise strike on American forces. Any illusions of a clean, decisive naval victory vanished in the flames. The United States now faced a logistical nightmare. This animated diagram shows the geographic scale of the European theater overlaid against the Pacific Ocean. The war against Japan would have to be fought across tens of millions of square kilometers of open water, magnifying the difficulty of locating enemy fleets and supplying massive task forces. To cross this massive expanse, commanders developed an approach known as leapfrogging or island hopping. Instead of confronting every entrenched garrison, American forces would simply bypass the most heavily defended fortresses. They would seize lightly guarded strategic islands and use them as forward bases to project air and naval power. From a map room in Washington, this looked like a highly efficient solution. It provided a direct route to the Japanese home islands, while theoretically minimizing casualties by avoiding full-scale continental invasions. Executing this strategy required specialized technology. The Navy and Marine Corps relied heavily on shallow draft landing craft, like the Higgins boat. Because these vessels could navigate shallow waters, troops no longer needed to assault heavily defended deep water ports. They could be dropped directly onto hostile coastlines. Yet the transition from a sterile logistical map to a physical beach was immediate and violent. During the bloody morning of Tarawa, the first contested landing, American Marines packed into these boats and advanced into a deadly crossfire from entrenched positions. By the end of the first day alone, 1,500 Americans lay dead among the obstacles and pillboxes that cluttered the shore. The clinical arrows drawn by strategists connecting one island to the next represented an inescapable meat grinder for the men tasked with securing them. High command remained divided on the exact route to take. General Douglas MacArthur aggressively lobbied for a southern swing through the Philippines. Meanwhile, Admiral Chester Nimitz plotted a northwesterly approach, straight toward the Japanese main islands. President Roosevelt ultimately approved a two-pronged strategy utilizing both routes. But no matter which commander's target was selected, the Marine infantry bore the physical cost of taking it. As the American offensive pushed deeper into the Pacific, Japanese defenders realized their navy could no longer hold off the massive U.S. fleets. They adapted their defensive doctrine entirely. Instead of trying to crush the landing forces on the vulnerable beaches, they shifted to a war of attrition. They retreated into the island interiors, carving complex networks of caves and bunkers deep into the elevated coral rock. Before an invasion, American task forces would unleash massive aerial and naval bombardments, hoping to soften the defenses. Against a subterranean, heavily concealed enemy, these awe-inspiring barrages proved largely useless. By simply digging down, Japanese forces stripped away American numerical superiority. They forced the U.S. military into a primitive, agonizing crawl. The Battle of Peleliu laid bare the horrifying effectiveness of this strategy. This map visualizes the suffocating density of the operation. 30,000 troops of the 1st Marine Division and the Army's 81st Division landed to root out 10,000 heavily fortified Japanese defenders. All 40,000 men were compressed into an active combat zone covering just 6 square miles. There was no room to maneuver and nowhere to hide. The jagged coral and dense jungle foliage forced American soldiers into claustrophobic combat. This grueling close-quarters fighting lasted for weeks on end. To clear the hidden cave systems, the infantry had to rely on brutal close-quarters tools. Explosives and flamethrowers became the only reliable methods for silencing the deeply entrenched firing positions. The grand, continent-spanning naval strategy developed by officers decades prior had been reduced to the grim task of clearing tunnels in the dark. For the individual rifleman on the ground, the psychological toll was absolute. Reflecting on Peleliu decades later, Marine veteran Eugene Sledge captured the reality of the campaign. He wrote, "We were resigned to the dismal conclusion that our battalion wasn't going to leave the island until all of the Japanese were killed, or we had all been hit. We merely existed from hour to hour, from day to day, numbed by fear and fatigue." The cruelest element of the island-hopping campaign was its unyielding operational tempo. If a soldier managed to survive a brutal, month-long battle, their unit was rotated out, hastily resupplied, and thrown directly into the next invasion just 3 or 4 months later. Sledge himself was evacuated from Peleliu in late November 1944. 4 months later, he and his fellow survivors were ordered right back into the 82-day inferno of Okinawa. Ultimately, the island-fubbing strategy succeeded. It systematically dismantled the network of Japanese defensive bases and secured the forward airfields needed to bring the war to the home islands. The cost of traversing the vast Pacific was paid in the blood of entire infantry divisions, tasked with carving their way through island paradises that had been transformed into hell on Earth.